Thank you. We are going to be sharing a evaluation guide and template that we've been working on for many, many, many months alongside some really brilliant friends and partners. And we've heard, as the Wallace Center has been learning about and trying to support value chain coordination for years, that evaluating it, capturing the impact, and telling the story of why it's important and what it does to a community's food system is really hard. It's complicated work. A lot of it's intangible, but we know it's really important. So we created this tool to help capture the impacts and give folks doing this work some tools to do a better job of explaining why their work is so important. So I'm really excited about this. It's like very nerdy, but it's also really awesome and powerful. And my colleague Andrew has been really leading the charge. And I remember when we first started talking about the idea of making this framework, I was like, I have no idea how to start. And Andrew has such a brilliant mind for evaluation. And I'm just really proud of him for doing such a wonderful job. So he'll be walking you all through what we've done. But before we do that, I just wanted to share our cultural agreements, which is something that we do in Food Systems Leadership Network spaces. Is just a reminder that when we get together, we get to decide how we want to be together. So we created these cultural agreements, which if you come to FSLN calls a lot, you'll definitely recognize them. Just a good reminder of how to be in community together and how to have a really productive, brave, and fun conversation. I'm not going to read these all out because, again, we do cover them quite often. But if you want to take a look, read through them and see if any one is really standing out to you today, one that you really feel like you want to focus on or bring into the conversation, go ahead and put that in the chat or just write it down, think about it in your head, and then we'll move on to the next part of the conversation. All right, so today Rip is thinking about meeting each other where we are. I thought that was such a generous way to approach conversations. I think I'm gonna think about challenging assumptions. Courtney is gonna take care of mental, emotional, and physical needs. I get that. Elizabeth is also gonna meet each other where we are and participate maybe by showing up, and that's great. All right, well, I think that's it for me. I'm gonna hand it off to Andrew to walk you through what this platform is and also get some input from some brilliant folks who helped us create it. And feel free to use those community agreements or borrow or update them and bring them into whatever spaces you're in. We love when folks rip off and duplicate. All right, Andrew, you're up.
All right, thanks, Ellie, for kicking us off. And before we get into the evaluation framework too much, wanted to start just by setting that up conversation with some general conversation about evaluation and also how community and equity are centered in those before we get into this tool. And so I wanted to welcome two people that were part of creating this. And Don Thilmany really from the start was on the advisory group that had shaped this tool, and Dakari Howard with the Illinois Department of Agriculture was a reviewer that really just helped shift my perspective on it and really focus on how community is involved in evaluation. So wanted to thank them for their input on it, but also to start and share their perspective. This really was a group effort of about 15 people probably that were having input over about 2 years on it. So it was not just me, I was just doing a lot of listening over these 2 years. Yeah, well, why don't we start with introductions. Don and Dakari, you can introduce yourselves and then I'll kick us off with a question.
Ari, do you want to go first? Or take me
to? I got up in. Hey, everybody, I'm Dakari Howard. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the policy advisor over at the Illinois Department of Agriculture, looking at urban agriculture and food systems and just identifying different ways that we can include young people in those spaces into what might look like an ag or food career going forward. But my background is in agricultural economics. I was formerly the supply chain development specialist with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. Just identifying different ways that we can include BIPOC, women-owned, veteran-owned farms and food businesses into different wholesale institutional markets vis-a-vis the Good Food Purchasing Policy adopted by Chicago and Cook County. So still in community with a ton of folks. I also was a farmer at one point in time, so that like led me to this work. But yeah, just an extension of all of these different conversations and to larger audiences and figuring out how we could be more collaborative in our approach for building a stronger, more resilient food system. I'll pass to you, Don.
Thanks, Dakari. I'm Dawn Thilmany. I'm a professor of Ag and Resource Economics at Colorado State University, and was fortunate enough to get to be someone who helped start our food systems team over 15 years ago now, which means I've gotten to do a lot of community-based work in Colorado, but I've also excitedly got to do a lot of projects with the USDA, including the Ag Marketing Service, who really is focused on this area. And my newest news is I get the fortune to co-lead one of the new regional food centers out of the Northwestern Mountain region. So this is a very timely project for me because we're of course going to have had this hat on. So although I am at a campus level, I'm really fortunate with my extension position to be all the way at the level I get to go do community-based food assessments. We're wrapping one up in San Luis Valley right now, but I also have gotten to be on some great national teams, including this one. So I have the best of all worlds because I get to see this from a bunch of different lenses and try to bring some of that perspective today.
All right. Yeah. Thanks you all for joining and sharing your perspective on this. And, just to start, evaluation doesn't sit alone in our work, shouldn't be an isolated piece of it. It's really directly linked to your strategy. So you've got to be clear in your strategy to evaluate it, and also to communications, because what you learn through your evaluation, you can share out with the community in a reciprocal way. So it's, it's a part of all of your work, and it should be all linked together and hopefully not an isolated thing. And that should hopefully is clear through this framework as well. But wanted to start with a question, just asking, why is it important to involve community in evaluation? Sometimes that doesn't always happen, but I know we've all spoken about that. Maybe starting with Dakari, if you want to share, why it's important to have community involved in evaluation.
I guess more recently I'm learning that as like a state employee, like a public official, is like accountability is augmented in this space. So including community is to your best benefit, not be accused of doing wrong with public dollars. But prior to that, I think I've looked at it as like a really important element of evaluation and development of different projects and programs, because back in college, I kind of read like about the standpoint theory, and that was just kind of sharing about how knowledge, if it's like siloed in the space, and that with that silo space, attempting to incorporate some kind of like programming or facilitation of some kind of good for a larger community, but that community isn't involved with that, you'll have a partition between like, what you all might think is important and like what you all like feel as though should be like evaluated, but that's not actually what the reality of like people's situations might be. For example, we might be looking at like, if we see like an issue going on like within a school system, we might, accidentally, if you're like in silo space, kind of look at that as like something that needs to be like a punitive response, as opposed to like saying like, how can we like collectivize and saying like what kind of like positive enforcement that we could use and incorporate in the school, and like what's the relationship between like school and like punitive response. So just examples like that, where it's really important to have like community voice within that space to make sure we're having like the most useful tools possible with different resources, if like those silo spaces do hold like a lot of power for administrative changes. So it in my experience has been like a really positive relationship when community is included in those actions, because they could also determine like how we also guiding it, as opposed to just like incorporating that initial step and preventing some kind of like social justice tourism from happening, where folks kind of come in and just get that initial conversation happening, and then they kind of leave, and then they kind of carry the work for themselves, and community is included in that process building. And then they come back and they say like, this isn't what we really had in mind initially, but they only had like a tidbit of information from that initial conversation. So I think it's important to not only just like include community in that initial conversation, but to also like employ community and like not even just as auxiliary voices, but put them in leadership positions when we're talking about doing community efforts. So I'll pass it over to you, Don.
Yeah, well, that's hard to follow up on because I think you got some great points there. I was in a slightly different position. It's odd the way our educational system is set up now that once you get this magical PhD and your professor, people mostly invite you to conversations as the expert to come and talk at them. And I think there was just some pivot during my extension career when I took on that role, where I luckily ran into the right kind of colleagues who helped me to understand and embrace that we're going to be so much more impactful if we let the community be the experts in what they're an expert in, which is the context of the situation. And then we look like far more clever experts coming in if we customize what advice we're doing or what we're trying to measure to the issue at hand. And so I was kind of figuring it out in a very haphazardly way early in my career, but I'll actually give some credit. I think Deb Trope's on the call. USDA Ag Marketing Service actually asked a bunch of us economists to come together, gosh, almost a decade ago now, to put together an economic impact toolkit. And as we got in a room and started talking, we all, even economists, and we're usually not good at this, realized we needed to step back and actually say, before they even can frame the right economic question for us to ask, we needed to coach in this toolkit that we have still up at Local Food Economics, a toolkit of how you set up community conversations, make the right people be at the table and so forth, so that we're even answering the right questions. Because sometimes we realized it needed to go 3 steps further back than what they were asking us to do. So even though I'd already kind of been bumbling around in that space, that project was the first, I think, really cement in the mind of me and some of my colleagues, how particularly economists in that specific field could back up into community conversations to make sure we were being as impactful as we could. And then that's just opened the door for me to get involved with a whole bunch of other scientists with great toolboxes for me to understand how other social sciences are embracing that as well. And so, yeah, then when you guys asked me to be on this toolkit, it felt like perfect timing to kind of start piecing some of those puzzle pieces together. So, I came from the very opposite end of like the expert who had to actually slow conversations down. It's like, well, I'll come and talk to you, but I actually want to make sure part of that conversation is me understanding what's going on there. So I'm even giving good advice. And so it's been really fulfilling for me to actually switch that way I do my programming, and then to see a whole bunch of my colleagues do the same.
Thanks. Yeah, it's important for accountability, to have community involved, like you were saying. And also, I heard you both say it made your programming or made the work stronger because you were integrating people that know the most details about it, that are right there. So kind of building on that, wanted to talk about how you center equity in evaluation work. Involving community is one way of that, but what are some other things that you've seen that you've learned to incorporate equity and center that in evaluation work?
When it comes to food systems work, I guess primarily taking inventory about who's in this room and how we collectivizing ideas to come up with some decision making practices, and then with that inventory saying okay, what's missing within that, and what information is key in identifying what these conversations are, so that we could get in an echo chamber, right? And then that's how we start coming up with our own ways of thinking and our own languages that we place on things, when that's something that we're getting so far away from what the I guess what the layman's terms are within community, and we're making it very just jargony and academic in a lot of ways, and so I think about that when I come into spaces. So one is identifying what my lived experience is, and being able to incorporate that as well, and also encouraging folks to say outside of what our professional hats are, what also is your lived experience. And I think that's something that's pretty tangible when we're talking about food and agriculture, because you might think of yourself as a director of a program, or you might be a food worker, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's what's your food mobilization observations happening within community? What does it look like for food accessibility? And so immediately you might think of proximity or something like that, but you might think about proximity, right? So then you might start addressing transportation issues, but then things might still be on the shelves, at your grocery store. And then you might notice those things on the grocery store shelves might be fresh and ready food. And you might think that it might be a deficit of community understanding how to eat with healthy and fresh options, when the consideration might not be that we might have a really strong houses population within that community, or people who might not have access to a kitchen. So like being able to like really think about like what are those lived experiences that you may have and bringing those into those spaces. And you could have just also like serve as like advocate for community within that. If we don't have the funds or like we don't have like the time span to like actually sit down and get a focus group and bring them into the space. But just community, just like really like being conscientious to what is this program that like we're creating and like who isn't able to access some of these programs that we have and like why not, and like is it our responsibility to do that, or like should we tap into like another organization that's doing that well and we can learn from them, and we could also like reallocate some of those funds to like really supporting folks on the ground that's already doing that work in a really important way. So those are just like some of the practices that you know I've been fortunate enough to like be in the room for. But then I also choose just like identifying like what other communities are out there, like because we don't want to just have like the same groups that's constantly like building up the framework, because that's essentially just doing like a power shift. But then just finding out like who are like those smaller actors like within that space, and like how can we like check in with them and like also like collectivize and like empower each other within that space as well. So I'll pass it over to you, Dan.
I had to keep following up on really good answers. This is hard. I want to go first next time. But anyways, yeah, all good points. I have to tell you another place where I really have fumbled through my career and luckily been in the right places at the right time to learn from people. But to be honest, here at CSU, because we did not have a lot of admin support for this, we started with populations of convenience, and that was who was reaching out to us. So probably our first 10 years of our programming, that just happened to be beginning farmers and then veteran farmers and women farmers here in Colorado. Those are the people who were, I guess, confident enough or connected enough to know to reach into us. And so we kind of designated an amount of demand that was needed in these spaces by who was calling us. Well, then, of course, we have an epiphany because we then get linked into the national network to realize, well, that's pretty easy for us to do. And although those were underserved communities as well, for sure, here too, we've now gone out and tried to build the trust and social capital in circles who weren't as comfortable calling us. And I have to tell you, much harder work, needs lots more time, much more patience, much more resources. But we've all made a commitment it's worth the time, even when sometimes, quite honestly, they push back and say, no, thank you. But we've had the same success as what Dakari's mentioned, like, well, then we go and find the groups they do trust and we empower them and get them resources. And we are so thankful that several of our funding agencies, including AMS, but also NEEF and so forth, now understand when we write grants that we're putting in stipends for the organizations, connectors and community leaders who allow us to actually expedite building that trust in those communities, because we're resourcing them up and not just coming as Dakari said, as tourists to come be a part of their event. And so we're still, I would say, struggling in this space, but we're finding some good strategies. And that's why you'll see in some of the evaluation guide, we even really give credits for that building of trust and connections and embeddedness and belongingness as one of the metrics we think we should be evaluating in these VCCs, because, oh my gosh, that's been just so powerful, at least for us and what I've seen happen and so forth. And I don't think we can do the equity work without that, because quite honestly, there's still a lot of mistrust and disconnectedness. And again, if we are then going to ask the people who are giving us funding for this to fund building those connections and getting resources to those groups who already have the trust, then the accountability has to be in whether we've actually built out some trust there. So I think that's why you also see a wide array of evaluation metrics that we put in there, is because not only do we want to say we're about DEIJ, we need to have the accountability to measure if we're going to invest resources in building out that trust within more equitable ways of doing our work. We have to have pathways to actually make sure we're making progress on that. And so I think it also really shows up in how we decided to call success metrics on this guide. Sorry if that was a long answer, but Dakari had all the really good answers, so I had to get it down to like specifically saying how this ended up showing up in the guide, at least in the way I contributed to it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think those things do show up in the guide and help people to step through the process, because equity is a hard thing to get your hands around sometimes. But there's some tangible things that are practices people can incorporate. And the last question, and then we'll have a few minutes for audience questions, so you can throw them in the chat if they're coming to you. But and we'll start with Dawn. But have you seen value chain professionals or businesses leverage their evaluation results? Like, how can they use the results for good?
Probably the example that pops to mind the easiest for me is what's been going on with what was Gus Schumacher's mustard seed of an idea, gosh, a long time ago now, and what's happened in the Double Up Food Bucks community is I think there was some very targeted, specific, direct pilots of that a long time ago. And what was interesting about that is the reason I think, even though it was new to me when it was introduced to me, it hit so many of the metrics at that point that I was starting to track. Of course, I get pulled into conversations mostly for economic impacts, but I could not ignore them when I was in some of these food systems meetings that people were worried about food access and better nutrition choices, or at least the ability to make those choices, and what this meant for community embeddedness and so forth. So then when you see a program like that that can hit so many of those check boxes for potential community wins, you pay attention. But I feel like that community did an exceptional job of showing the wins for eaters, the wins for the farmers who these people were buying produce from, for the markets, for bringing a new set of clientele to farmers markets that sometimes have been portrayed as for only the rich or the elite or so forth. So I feel like that was actually a program that really kind of opened my eyes to, if you can frame a really good story and the larger portfolio of people with shared values that can see a win in it for them is really going to help escalate and elevate how much attention and new resources might flow to that. So that'd be my example of where I had the epiphany, because again, I've been in my narrow kind of little econ land of how clever some people can be about showing the portfolio of wins, and why that's kind of based on you upfront knowing what your metrics you're going to measure are.
Yeah, like, yeah, to that same point, I think the example that I'll use is just like my experience with the good food purchasing policy. And yeah, I think one, sometimes like quantitative evaluation is like challenging to like really get like a full grasp of like what's kind of going on. And then understanding like how do we like kind of come up with a qualitative report that like not only suits to like what, you know, whoever your funder is, or like whatever the bill was written to say, like we're looking for this specifically, but like also include in what was valuable for like community, to like be a, you know, be like a qualifying element like within narrative writing. But you know, I do see, I'm like optimist. And so like when we kind of like are faced with like some kind of constraints or like outcomes that like weren't always ideal, like you could like really use that. So in the good food purchasing policy, when I first hopped on to that policy, it was almost being like categorized as like a failing project, right? Because it wasn't a ton of like BIPOC producers entering, you know, and having like success stories like through that. But that doesn't mean like that the program is bad or anything like that. It's a story within that. And so we got to figure out like how to identify like what's going on within that story. And so like what you come to realize is that like we're talking about having like BIPOC farmers who are here hyper locally, like within Chicago, just working on like a vacant lot of like land. And we're trying to like figure out like how do we like scale up in volume. And so by scaling up in volume, that like so it's two ways of even like looking at like hyper urban agriculture here, like in Chicago. It's like one, you have like a business owner, and then two, you have like a service provider. And that's because it's not a lot of food within that community in itself. And so you got to be really careful about saying that like we'll start scaling up and getting like this food into like these institutional markets where like the community that you might be servicing might not have access to some of those public institutions because it might not be affordable, or it might be like an academic barrier, et cetera. And so you don't want this like mass exodus of like food leaving the community for the sake of profit, because that's not what they're as interested in. And so it's trying to like figure out like, okay, this lack of data doesn't mean that the program is failing. It means that we need to have like a cultural shift to looking at like what's important for this community and how can we ensure that like communities like being like supported and empowered like within this program frameworks. And then like also taking inventory about like what resources do these public institutions have that could be successful, or like that could be useful for the success of like these farmers. So like if you're like a well-endowed institution, like, it's time to go in the pockets. Or like if you have like a lot of land, you should like figure out like an equitable way for like farmers to be able to produce on that land if they're selling it to your cafeteria in a way where they still have like autonomy with how they want to do business, as opposed to becoming like modern day sharecroppers. So it's like it's really intentional work within that. But that was something that I really thought was cool, and how we were able to like build up a story behind that, because a lot of times like that qualitative data isn't as respected as the quantitative data, because within a lot of our frameworks, it's like based on like timelines and like capital, and like just wanted to make sure like that we're having enough funds to like not get in trouble. But that's not the same metrics that community uses. So that was really important, that we were able to like kind of like also not even just tell that story, but then also like include some of these like procurement folks like within that conversation too. And so we will have like continuous events, bringing like called the buyer and supplier network building. So it's one like education for like different farmers and food business owners like within the area about like what even is GFPP, because like, we might think we have a good marketing strategy, but it's only as good as like we think it is. And that doesn't mean that it's always going to like translate clearly to what community is interpreting. So we bring them in and have a conversation to say like, we don't want to subjugate you to this thing, but we also want to like have you build on this so we can make it a useful tool for you, because it's essentially for you. And we just need to know what's relevant to you right now. So not only was like farmers and food producers like involved in that process, but also like procurement folks to say like, okay, like I could understand that, but then at the same time, like a lot of these people are hired into a position to like make sure like money isn't being lost, and they're being trained by somebody who like that was also the prerogative too. But when doing like equitable purchasing, it's not always cheap. You got to like really invest in that. And so like that conversation was had, and like we built on from that. And we had some really strong superstars that came out from distribution channels, farmers who were like able to like do like peer-to-peer mentorship and coaching folks, with like what that conversation might look like, and we'll enter into institutional markets, but then also having conversations with those institutional markets, to not just say like these farmers aren't ready, but like take a look at themselves and say like maybe we aren't ready to do this, and like what do we need to do to become ready in that. So that was a really interesting way to how we just like reframed how we looked at the evaluation metrics that we were using at first, into coming up with something nice and beautiful, and something that we could like grow from, not only from the community level, but procurement, state, etc.
Excellent. And that's a great example of how the strategy shifted after the results came in about the GFPP program, and how evaluation and strategy are just so linked. And Don as well with the GusNet program, how that just grew out of that. Their strategy of the federal government changed from seeing the results of this pilot program on it. There was a question from Dakari. I don't know if you can answer this quickly, or if we could come back to it later, but Deb was asking about ways to incentivize culturally appropriate local retail in an urban center. I don't know if you have any quick responses to that.
I think I got a longer one. I'm pretty abstract, but I got you. And I could start to type. And if there is, I don't know how much time we have left, Andrew, and I wouldn't want to like take up too much time and disrupt the schedule. But if now is a good time, or like if we should come back.
Yeah, maybe if you want to type some out now, we can come back to it. We have another time for Q&A later as well. Yeah. But
just briefly too, like one thing about Chicago is like it's just like a very like immersed, we got like a pretty like just wide demographic here, where people representing cultures from all over the place. But one thing in that policy that I was talking about, it was like primarily targeted at like farmers and food business owners, but street vendors were not included in that. And I think that's like a really strong connection to like people feeling like they have like culturally responsive foods. Street vendors, they serve like a really important role within our communities, just by way of like, for example, like African Americans like here in the United States, like oftentimes they feel like they've been severed from like any diasporatic like food and culture, et cetera. And that might be a market for like folks to just like tap in and be able to like purchase food in that way. But we got to figure out how like we can support these street vendors in the same way, because they have like a different way of like receiving income, taxes, et cetera, protections for like our undocumented citizens, because we're also a sanctuary city. So like figuring out like, okay, how do we like really create like strong policy to like support that, support this like this piece of like our pie chart, or like our food ecosystem. because it's like really, really, important. And like maybe, that looks like us having like a partnership with some of our street vendor associations and like bringing them into like the space and, creating some facilities around shared kitchen opportunities, et cetera. That's a quick answer. I can give you some more later. But.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that is, yeah, such a good point of an overlooked group of vendors in the, in that program. But yeah, thank you all for joining for this. We'll also have time for Q&A later in the call. So we're going to shift and I'll share the evaluation framework, walk through the guide and the template and give you some time to apply on your own. And then we'll have some Q&A after that with Dawn and Dakari here as well, so that we can all answer questions as we get into application. Okay, are you all seeing the framework slide? Okay, thanks. So as Ellie said, this is something that was developed over a couple of years by the Wallace Center to help value chain professionals to support you in your role around evaluation by aligning evaluation with your values, focusing and clarifying your evaluation, and just documenting the impact of your work. And it includes a guide that can walk you through the process in 6 steps to working from your values all the way down to your metrics, and templates that have sample metrics that are based on research from the field, from things that Dawn and Dakari and others contributed to. Hey, here's what we measure. Here's what I think should be included. And also with Sarah Rocker, who's a researcher and had done a lot of work with value chain professionals on training on evaluation, and also some preliminary work that this was really built on that. And one of the things in Sarah's work was clarifying the roles for value chain coordination. And, as I said earlier, this is for people in all different types of roles, in both the primary and the enabling roles of this work. And so I wanted to go over those really quickly if you're not familiar. I think we have on previous COP calls, but the primary roles are people, mostly in the transactional part of the value chain. So doing market matchmaking, providing technical assistance to growers and businesses, and pulling people together. The enabling roles are more supportive of others in the system. So gathering resources for the work, doing policy advocacy, research, and assessment evaluation. So there are 2 different ways of supporting value chains, and the framework is for both of those. So there's things that are more about measuring the flows of product and specific attributes of the product that you're moving, and also things about who's involved and who's not involved, and what positions are people able to reach through your support in elevating people in their work in the value chain. So that's a quick primer on the roles. There's a link in the documents to a sheet that goes through the roles in details, those more, but we'll be referring to these later, and you'll see them in the guide in the template. So I wanted to show those here. So how to use the guide? It's really something to work through with a team, and it does take time. The beta testing group that went through it, it was about 6 months for them to do it, and some could have done it faster, some worked through it faster, and some didn't complete it. So it does take a lot of time commitment, because you're rethinking one of the major parts of your work, of your evaluation. But the guide document includes prompts that you can work through and record your notes, starting with your why or your values, and then ending with metrics. So it's a worksheet that you can download, and you can do at your own pace, do with your team or partners to work through that together. And the steps I'll work through here in a minute, but starting with listing your values, and then defining community, because that's such an important part of this. And then how do you link your values to your strategy, identifying your role, your primary roles that you're focused on, considering levels of impact, and then completing your plan. And the framework and this, the steps are just meant to make this an easier process for you. If you're lost in evaluation or new to it, it's not in your background, you're trying to figure out, how do I evaluate this work that I'm doing, moving product, what's the ultimate impact of it? This can help you to make some of those connections. So I'm going to walk through, these are the steps in the guide. So starting with values, and this could be an easy step if you're clear on it and you've done this work. What are the values that guide my work, and how is racial equity reflected in these, and why or why not? And if this is something that you aren't clear on, that's where strategy work comes in, and you can do some of that as you go. But starting with that, grounding in your values, and then defining community. That's referred to a lot in the guide, and as we were just talking about, you know, it's important to get that perspective, community perspective in your work and your evaluation plan. So you want to think about intentionally who the community is that you're supporting and who you're accountable to. So defining that, you know, what types of businesses, is it farmers or consumers, and what's the racial and socioeconomic makeup of the community. And then starting to get more specific and honing in on your strategies. So thinking from your values, well then what, based on those, what would the community look like for successful in 5 to 10 years? What are some of the, what's the impact of that? And how were community members involved in shaping that or determining that, the ultimate impact? And from there, working even shorter term to 1 to 2 years, what are the outcomes that would help you to reach that? So these are all steps in the guide that you can work through with your team as you go through. And then getting even more specific, so based on those outcomes in 1 to 2 years, what are the roles you need to focus on to get there? What is the market matchmaking needed to do that? Or is it more technical assistance to different groups? So the worksheet lists all the roles and your activities and your outputs, and also your partners, because we know that not one even organization can do all the roles. So it's important to map out who's doing what, to know who you need to partner with and how in order to reach that vision. Then after that, it's important to consider your levels of change. So you might be looking at, you know, sales for the month or for the year, but think about the ripple effects over, what about in 3 years or 5 years? What's the change that you want to see that you're building towards? And the same thing for the scale of the impact, from individuals or businesses to the community and to even broader systems that take a long time to have impact, but your work can build towards that. So as you look at your metrics, I didn't put, was too hard to put in a slide, but there's a you know, a chart where you can look at an intersection of scales from individual up to the system and of time to help you map out, to see if you're tracking things on different levels, just to know if you have a diversity of perspectives there. And then the last step is completing your evaluation template. And I'll show this in just a minute, but that is it's a spreadsheet that practitioners can use to build your evaluation plan based on all the things that we learned, all the partners that contributed to this project. And it includes a list of metrics that folks use and suggested for value chain coordination, and templates for tracking your data, from a dashboard for a high level to even like little sheets to look at, track things from individual events and track those over time. And I will say the template is focused on quantitative metrics, but there is also important quantitative or qualitative aspect to this. And there's a storytelling resource in the guide capturing value chain or value creation stories, where people can share their story about if they're involved in your work, what the impact was for them. And those, even for us, are some of the most meaningful things and the best ways that we capture to talk about our work, is hearing from people that have been involved over time to hear their story. All right, so I'm going to switch now to show the template and just do this quickly, and then we'll have time for questions on this. Okay, are you seeing the spreadsheet? You may not be able to see it that well, but this is the template that I was speaking about. So the first thing is the Word document, it's a guide, and then this, once you work through that and have your clarity about your roles and your impact, as an instructions tab, and then there's the metrics that I mentioned. So there's I think over 30 of them in here that are all mapped out by role, and you can add your own activity, and then your level of change. Is it a output, outcome, or impact? And then track your data from baseline, you know, what's the current number, what's your goal you want to get to, and then add your results. And then where we had them, there's resources. So there's a lot of past work in this that we're building on. So we reference to that, and also resources around integrating equity into the work. You know, prompts around how do you incorporate racial equity in a certain measure. So for each one, there's a question about that. And then even assigning like who's going to be in charge of this on our team, who's the person that will be in charge of it. So this is the listing of all of them. It's not meant that you would use all of these. The guidance is really to pick 3 to 5 metrics and then copy those over to this template where you can have your own, you can set up your own system. But the way it's set up, you can copy it right over and track your numbers in here. And it includes a demographic breakdown where you can track that across your results. And so here's an example you can look through and just see what it looks like with populated data. And then another resource is the tracking system. So this is where you could list all of your events over the year, and I'll show the one filled out. So if you have convenings, you have 2 convenings in the year, and there's 2 evaluation questions that you ask at each one that are really important. You could track those in here and then roll those up into a dashboard. So once you get this set up, then it helps you to track over time and be prepared for sharing it. Then the last thing are some questions. These are focused more on those supportive roles. They're the ones that we use for the Food Systems Leadership Network, and they're more qualitative on on relationships, or on did you build skill, on impacts for people. But I think a lot of you all are doing trainings and doing things that are could be tracked in a similar way to that, and it's not just tracking economic impact. Then the last thing I wanted to say here was just thank you to all of these folks who gave input into it. There was an advisory group that really helped to shape it, and then a group of beta testers over the past year that walked through it and then gave me feedback throughout on how we can improve it, make things more clear. And so thanks to all of them, we got to this point of it. And now we have time for, I think, just questions on this, and then Ellie's going to walk through, share a way that you can apply this to your own work. So does anyone have any questions on what I just shared on the guide or the template, or how any of this works?
We're getting a lot of love in the chat so far, Andrew.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, nope, just lots of people saying thank you. We would love questions, but thank you is also feels real good. Looks like Patricia's
I had a
up.
question.
I can't hear who's talking. So let's do Patricia, and then whoever just talked, we'll get to you next.
Thanks, Ellie. Excuse me. We're in a couple hats here as a fundraiser for Slow Food USA. What I'm just not hearing, and maybe I've missed it and I've been out of the loop for a bit, but like this evaluation framework, how is it sort of, because a lot of this work, at least in previous conversations I've been involved in, I know some USDA representation is on the phone. They've been a great funder. Extension programs kind of have also been in that role. But I just want to make sure I understand how we take this evaluation to funders. I'm part of obviously a national network with Slow Food, but it just feels to me like value chain coordination has become such a key. It's just kind of risen to the top of the bucket, for lack of a better term. And I think it's really important, as Dakari said, we just don't want a lot of social justice tourism. But how can we use this framework to really go back and help educate, is probably too strong of a term, but really create a dialogue with funders who are excited about this work and are probably going to do maybe short-term investments. And I mean, how do we kind of build this out for the long haul so that we can create more, not just the funding to get us started, but also the business model to keep this vital work going? That's just my thought.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think taking it to funders, and part of the goal of this was to help people define their own terms of evaluation with their community, so it's not just funder determined. So I hope that people that use this can educate their funders on it, can share it and say, here's what we think really matters. We went through this process and this is the impact we want to have. We use this type of work to supplement our USDA required metrics. This was funded by an LFPA grant. And we go beyond that because there's other things, more qualitative, especially we want to share. As far as a broader strategy, we've taken that approach of sharing it with people and them going to funders, but yeah, I don't know if others have ideas on how this could be elevated or shared with funders to integrate into their work. Looks like Margaret said they use measured impacts to create a story to showcase, certain pieces to their funders. And so maybe you can share something that, that maybe they didn't ask for, but that's important that you want to share with the community. And then Tanya shared some resources for talking with funders, so that might be a good place to look as well.
Sure. I could share a little bit about what I meant in the chat, Andrew, if you want.
Okay, sure.
So, funders are looking for certain impacts and measures. And so we created what we called a link success kind of story. And so we would highlight certain projects or successes that we had measured, like you're using with a database or a tracking system in the past. And then we would highlight that in a little story and a short form 1 page that was just for the high level kind of funder stakeholder. And we did that quarterly. And so that was one way, instead of just giving them numbers, how we provided a different communication of the impact.
All right, yeah, thanks. I think we have some other folks with their hands up. Maybe, let's see, looks like Elias is next in line.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. As one of the people who was in the beta testing group, this is looking awesome. That's sort of where my question comes from. I was wondering if you or anyone on the call had recommendations for sort of like staying on top of this spreadsheet template. I've already found that like it sort of comes in shorter waves where it's like, oh yeah, like gotta go back to that and give it a few hours, and then it sort of like falls to the wayside. So like any, I guess, self accountability mechanisms to just sort of like chip away at it over time instead of letting it build and then needing to do it all at once. Maybe that's just like an internal issue, but I wanted to hear any thoughts.
I can respond a little bit, Andrew.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, again, back to funders, I think we're seeing more ready appetite for them to understand that we actually have to put staff time into our budgets for someone to be front and center and paying attention to evaluation. That wasn't true a decade ago, so that's a little bit of a win. The other thing we just did with our first project, I would say it's been hit and miss how well it's worked, is you can now do so much with technology to like set up perhaps even like auto forms that kind of poke everybody on your team every 2 weeks with a form with a set of questions that are kind of questions aligned with that tracking part of the spreadsheet that you're seeing there, and has them at least while it's top of mind, because usually you can at least do recall for 2 weeks, who you've met with, how many people were there, perhaps if you had any successes with new market access points or something. But you also, people have gotten more used to perhaps paying attention to their phone or than sitting down and just saying, oh, it's my day to report. So if they have something in their inbox that tells them it's time to check in and stuff, we had about half of the people really respond to that well, but it was still a half we weren't doing before. So I think it's also just finding some little processes that make it that it isn't just a once a year thing, because I think that's what we're all tempted into wanting to do. And so it'd be taking that tracking part of the survey, those sheets, and maybe embedding them into a form where you prompt everybody maybe every 2 weeks or month to do recall of what they have done in that space. But you still also need to probably have some more solid evaluation, like those surveys and stuff you do with programs, and or some social network analysis you're going to do after you've brought a team together for 18 months. So that's why I think you also need to think about where it's in your plan of work and your budget as well. Those are just 2 ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think, yeah, it depends on the rhythm of your work, how often the data you need is coming in. You know, if it's every day, then probably every 2 weeks should have some kind of reminder or time to get in there. For us, our team has a quarterly meeting that's our accountability to make sure everything's up to date. We collect most of our data through surveys, so it's just making sure we do collect from each event, and then we have a time where we pull that into our evaluation system. But I think, yeah, it depends on your style of a work and team, but it is a crucial part is actually using it and following up over time on keeping your data clean. All right, see, Brian's got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question, and thank you for this resource. I think it's really, really valuable and all the work that went into it. I have a question about sort of the metrics and the 30 some odd metrics that are there, and if in the guide there's if there's any, I guess, guidance or language around how to think about those metrics at the different, output, outcome, impact levels, because ultimately this is about systems level change, right? If you're really wanting to make the impacts. And so I guess I'm just curious if the team that worked on this, like how you all approach that, because, you can kind of measure the lower level output information all day, but it can be a struggle often, right, to understand then the larger change that might be happening in the system. So I would just love to hear any thoughts on that maybe went into this guide, and anything that maybe is in there as reference that could help with that piece.
Yeah, there are actually, I got feedback it was in there too much. So I had the definition of output, outcome, and impact several times. It's still in there in 2 sections, but yeah, we did want people to look at that, and outputs are just counts from activities. So it's like, you need to know that, like how many people show up or how much food you're moving, or, basic things like that. But then also looking at outcomes, like what's the impact on beneficiaries, like what's the output doing the next level up, and then impacts, is that progress towards your long-term goal, like the sum of those outcomes. So we have those definitions in there in places as a prompt for people to think about how their work relates to that, like how they could sit it within those 3 levels. And then also there's a chart that's got time and scale of community, so people can look at their work and also place it on there. But we didn't define the metrics in terms of output, outcomes, impacts, because that's really depends on each person's strategic plan, like how different activities fit in there. So we left those as a drop down so people can pick that, but hope that people would have a mix of those within it. And the metrics are hopefully a mix of that as well, that can be tailored to people's work. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that or other thoughts on that.
Oh, I just think it's why the spreadsheet probably does not do as good a justice as the worksheet, like you said, where we have groups think about what their values and what their leading vision is for what they are trying to change in the world. What are you drawing your circle around? I would say the metrics still do come in handy, because sometimes, at least if you're all like me, you get some writer's block about even actually how to start framing that story. So even if quantitative measures or checkboxes don't do justice to some of what we're doing, they are at least some anchor points to start building that story around. And so we probably did kind of break it into too many bite-sized chunks that it's hard to see how the puzzle's all going to come together. But I think every one of you probably has a different way your brain is wired, and so you'll all come at this a slightly different way. But I think Wallace was really good in guiding those of us who help him put it together, of being overly inclusive in any way, approach and metric people wanted to do, and people will pick and choose what's best for what they're trying to do. And so I think any one of these sets of materials would just kind of sit stalely on a shelf, but together I think they make a pretty good way to start thinking about how you're going to do your evaluation approach. And I imagine you'll all find some creative ways to improve upon it. And we're excited to see how that shapes up.
I think my other sort of thought here, Brian, is one of the things I've learned from this process is how closely intertwined strategy and evaluation are. So I think it was Andrew, someone showed me as sort of like a double helix where they sort of wrap around each other and grow and change together. And so I think, you know, as you think about the impacts that you're having strategically, like what's the scale of those, and trying to come up with metrics and ways of measurement that are in line with the kind of scale of impact that you can feel comfortable claiming.
All right, yeah, great questions. And you know, just so this is a long-term process and there's a lot to unpack on it, we tried to make it easy, but it's still, evaluation is a huge topic to apply to anything. So hopefully, you know, making it simple, but also opening up avenues for people to explore within this. I know we're a little bit over time, but Ellie, I wonder if you want to walk us through maybe some of the how folks could apply this to their work. Wanted to give everyone a little bit of a taste of it, and then we'll share the link to the full guide at the end so you can take it and play with it.
So as Andrew showed us in the when he was showing us the slides of the way that the framework works, the first thing that it asks you to do, that I guess we ask you to do, is to define your values and get really clear about the motivation for your work. Why are you doing this? Who are you serving? What's the change you want to see in the world through what you're doing? And just getting really specific about that, I think it's like a pretty powerful way to start. And then you can reflect back and think, hey, is the way that I'm evaluating actually related to those values? Are the questions I'm asking telling me if I'm making progress in alignment with the goals that I've said are important to me in my work? So we just wanted to give you all a few seconds, maybe a few minutes to write down and answer to some of these questions. We find that it's a really great way to get started. So you're going to have a little head start if you want to take this back to your team or your partners and work on this template with them, is to start by thinking about your values, thinking about what, you know, the core motivation is for your work, because it's often not because it's the easiest or most lucrative way to do it, but instead that there's something else motivating you to serve the farmers in your community, to make food accessible, you know, to make culturally relevant food available to people in hospitals. You know, there's a million reasons why folks entertain value chain coordination work. And so we're asking you just to take a few minutes, write down an overall goal for your VCC work, and then what you're currently tracking, what data you have, and how that current data reflects the values and goals you have for your work. We're just going to put on some tunes and give you all a chance to write down some notes on this, and then there'll be a quick report out, and then we'll wrap up. And if anybody's brave and wants to share what they jotted down in the chat or come off mute for just a minute and talk about anything that might have occurred to you, even in just a few minutes of reflection about the relationship between your values and goals and the way that you're evaluating your work now. Yeah, I'm on. Is anyone else having a hard time hearing Ahmad?
Oh. Sorry about that. That's probably much better, right?
Extremely, yeah, thanks.
So pardon me for that. It was on the Bluetooth. Anyway, thank you for those who shared really great information. I pulled up the tool on the FSLN website and I've been looking at it. I have not been doing other things if it looked like I wasn't present. So one of the values that we have, I wear a couple hats too, but I extend myself and align myself in spaces that have the same one. So it's stewardship of community learning. And one metric that I came up with today is number of growers that we've trained. And that includes for us, even, people who didn't know how to compost in their house or thought maybe you couldn't grow because you live in an apartment. And so we do a lot of urban education and outreach in the spaces that I work in. So I really appreciate today's conversation because you gave me those two to work with. And I work with, the hat that I wear when I signed up here is the National Women in Agriculture Association. It's a big organization, 15 years old. Our Central Valley chapter just started last September. And so I'm stewarding that chapter and really grateful for the input here. Mr. Dakari, I'll definitely email you. I heard that you have an interest in developing BIPOC and or women ag producers. So I think we have a intersection to navigate together. Thank you. Sorry if I was a little long. Great job, everybody.
No, thanks so much, Ahmad. It's great to hear that there have been maybe even some breakthroughs just on this call already. Thanks for sharing about your work. There's one from Rip in the chat. The overall goal is to highlight and support local-based food assets within a community, i.e. community gardens, farmers markets, education programs around food, etc. So people know they exist and can utilize them. And the value is that everyone should have access to affordable, healthy food. So there's a lot of different ways you can track that, but getting really clear hopefully helps think about what are ways you could ask, what are ways you can measure if that is actually happening. Tanya.
Thanks, Ellie. This was really great. So appreciate this. So timely for me too, which I'm going to explain why in my example. So I work for Farm to Institution New England, FINE for short. And for years now, our primary goal has been to get more regionally grown and produced food into institutions, schools, colleges, hospitals, prisons, jails. And I think Dakari's example with good food really explains some of the shortcomings beautifully in terms of that goal and sort of the theory of change behind it, which is that by getting more food into institutions, you're going to increase accessibility, you're going to increase regional strength of the food system and equity, but it's not necessarily there. So we're actually kind of shifting a little bit about the way we're approaching this, and we're starting a new project called Rooted in Community, where we're going to try to create farm to institution from the community up, really helping to make sure that the community is informing what that looks like and what are the priorities. And maybe that doesn't always look like food at institutions either, and that there are other ways that this all connects. And so the data that we have is a lot about what institutions are procuring. So we're going to be really shifting the way we collect data, and so this is going to be really timely to help me figure out, me and a whole huge team of people and our communities to help us figure out how to do that. So thanks.
Awesome. We're right on time. Cool. Well, thank you everybody who shared today, and especially to Dakari and Dawn who guided us through, just framing this conversation in context. A little wonky. There's a lot of spreadsheets, there's a lot of terminology. And so I just really appreciate you all reminding us why it's important to do this well and how much it can benefit the people that we work on behalf of. I just dropped a link to the guide in the chat so you can get in there and nerd out and download it and talk about it with your partners and try and get, it to apply to the things you're doing and hopefully help you. If you'd like to share feedback or have questions or whatever, please let us know. The Wallace Center team is available to help you think through or, talk through any little nuts that you need to crack. And there's just one or two other little housekeeping notes that I wanted to share before we wrap. We are taking July off from this community of practice. We got a lot of other programming stuff coming up in July that hopefully will be fun and fill the VCC COP size hole in your heart. So we will see you on this call in August. And the other thing I just wanted to make sure was on everyone's radar screen is that we are seeking applications right now for a learning lab that's focused on farm to food assistance. So any efforts where you're buying food at a fair price from farmers, and then that food is ending up in anti-hunger channels and helping people who need it access it. We're doing some financial support and technical assistance support for folks who are working in those farm to food assistance channels. The application is open till July 10th, and it comes with $20,000, which I know a lot of us could use. So keep that in mind, take a look at it. It's in the chat right now. And we'll send a follow-up email with all these links, including the recording and the link to the evaluation guide in case you didn't snag it when it came through the chat. And we really appreciate your time and hope everyone has a wonderful July if we don't see you. And we will talk in